Right then, and we're live. So I can see there's a few people in the chat already. Oh, and there's a few more. There's Anton. Yeah, so if you're in the lobby, sorry, if you're watching us, just let us know where you're from and a little bit about yourself whilst we just let a few more people join. And yeah, Jose, hi. So yeah, in this one, we're going to be going through e-commerce, structured data and what we can leverage and how to leverage it. And I know you two guys have got some really good presentations for us. So is there anything that you guys want to catch up with before we start jumping into this whilst everyone's joining us? Like a scheme wrap.
Imagine my own team showed up. I love when they do that.
Very nice. Where are my team? This is awful.
That's it, yeah. You're just on your own. Yeah, so yeah, well let's get started then. So I believe Martha, you're going to go first. Well, actually, right. So I'll let you introduce yourself. I know everyone knows who you already are, but please do a better job than what I would.
Sure. So my name is Martha Van Berkel, and I'm the CEO here at Schema App, and coming to you live from Guelph, Ontario, Canada. Actually in my office. So I'll share a little bit more about my knowledge graph as we jump in, but really excited to be part here and contributing to the SEMrush webinar series.
That's it. And Jono, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. I'm Jono. I work for a company called Yoast, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. If you're lucky enough to be a WordPress person, then hopefully you use our plugin. I run what's loosely known as our special ops team, which is all of our research and development, SEO stuff, and the delightful treat that is doing webinars like this, as well as being the kind of brains and muscle behind a lot of our schema implementation. So this is really my very, very favorite thing in the world of SEO to be talking about. So it's delightful to be back here again.
When we get a nerd out together, I love it.
Yes, this is the best.
That's it.
All these SEO conferences talking about links and content, it's all boring stuff. The schema's where it's really at.
That's it, yeah. Enough about links.
Yeah.
Right then, Martha, I'll let you kick off with the first presentation.
Sure. Let me go ahead and bring that up. You should be able to see my screen here. So everyone good? Loading, thinking. There we go. Schema markup for e-commerce. All right. So usually when I introduce myself, I actually use a knowledge graph because I am a totally schema markup nerd, where describe a little bit about like the fact that I grew up in enterprise at Cisco. I have a technical background. I'm not only the CEO, but one of the founders of Schema App. I'm Canadian. I have 2 lovely children, and I used to joke that my title was primarily CEO of the software company, but it's also Chief Entertainment Officer these days with COVID going on. I'm going to use, when I talk about schema markup, I'm referring to structured data, but I don't use structured data because schema markup is more specific. And when we're doing schema markup, we're really about like being absolutely specific about what we're talking about. And that's what we're passionate about at Schema App. So, when you think of schema markup, you think of code, but we think of it as a business strategy. And we're a full service enterprise solution for doing schema markup at scale. We're not afraid of any kind of site, and I'm going to jump into e-commerce today, but we are trusted by SEOs around the world and continue to love to help people and educate people about what they can do with schema markup in order to drive amazing results and insights. So today I've captured a couple pieces of news because I do think it's important as we kind of do these on a regular basis, just talk about what's changing because there's a lot changing, and Jono's going to build on a lot of what's changing in the vocabulary. And then I'm going to go through sort of like small, medium, large, or simple to complex, how you do schema markup in e-commerce. And then I'll talk a little bit about, strategically how you can use e-commerce schema markup or product schema markup within analytics. All right, so let's jump in. So we all had a cry, I think, over the summer when Google announced that they're officially going to be retiring structured data testing tool, and that the rich result testing tool is moving to GA. And this is good news in that like Google's going to actually keep the rich result testing tool up to date with documentation. They're also doing some more advanced things like being able to show, you can see here, it's recipes, recipe snippets, like showing different types of snippets. So if you are doing more advanced markup, let's say recipes with video and FAQ and others, that you actually will be able to see those results within this tool. The drawbacks are for those of us that like to see entities and nested entities with a lot less clicks, then that's sort of less ideal. But the good news is Google is responding to all of our feedback on what we want to see the tool evolve to kind of get back to that really simplistic, clear vision that we saw within structured data testing tool. There is a GitHub where Googlers and others within Schema Network are talking about a Chrome testing tool. And I think I actually even saw one come live today. We also have had a really rocky couple of months, with some of the Google algorithm changes. But when I look at it from a schema markup standpoint, we've been seeing a lot of impact to FAQ-rich results. And it primarily starts on July 15th. And we're seeing sort of, I'll say, a mix of results. Somewhere we're seeing sort of what I call like a drop on the 15th, but it sort of maintains just a lower performance level. Those are primarily where we see those in the financial sector, where we see sort of a drop on the 15th and then sort of almost a loss, like really low is in e-commerce. And this audience, I'd love to say, like, I know exactly why that's happening. The team's just digging into that right now. And then we'll be sort of announcing that to both our customers as well as sharing some of those insights with the market. And then the third area where we're seeing lots of fluctuation, where we see kind of drop and then I'll say bouncing in performance, is primarily in the healthcare sector. And so at Schema App, like, we're trying to dig into not just, what are we seeing, but, is it actually because of how they've put in the FAQ schema markup, where they've nested it, et cetera. And we'll be sharing those insights again with our customers and with the market. Now, with regards to e-commerce, there's also been a change where Google's been doing a lot of clarification. And one of the clarifications that they've done specifically around product is around the product-rich result being specific for a product and not for a category or a list of products. And so, for example, like shoes in our shop is not a specific product. It would be sort of a product model or a group of things that fall under one model, which is what I'm going to talk about. And then the last piece of news I want to highlight is, Jono and I are really, really passionate about sort of nested and proper schema markup. And on July 8th, they made an update to the documentation that basically said, like, make sure you're linking things together. So in the example they give here, it's about a recipe and a video. So if the page is primarily about a recipe and it has a video, make sure that you're actually nesting that video under the recipe and using @ID for both. Nesting might be a whole seminar we want to do with SEMrush in the future. With Schema App, we take care of the whole @ID, but most importantly, like connected, nested, proper schema markup, which if you've ever heard me talk is something that I like rant about all the time. Google's now documented that that's indeed what they want. So,
do you mind if I chip in on this? Because this is this is the thing, right?
This is it, right?
Biggest thing. And I know we pitched this as an advanced webinar, and I think this is the difference between basic schema and advanced schema. And every SEO in the world can copy and paste or use Google Tag Manager or write their own basic schema to say this is a video or this is a recipe. The step to advanced is using IDs to link and build connections between those entities. This is what it's all about. So if this sounds alien to you, if you haven't got to this level, this is where you need to be looking. You need to be describing networked relationships of things. And it's so delightful that Google have finally said, oh, by the way, this is a thing. Oh, just wonderful.
They've made me an honest woman, frankly, like, because like, people I think thought I was, full of it for the last 5 years where I talked about this, but this is like where the semantic piece comes in, right? So by actually having @IDs, like you're actually starting to reference entities on the site and make sure that, you understand where something is managed. And again, as a semantic technology company at Schema App, like this is sort of foundational to how we think about markup. But good evidence from Google that is indeed what they want to see happen. And it also, like John Mueller, there was a great quote from him in January where he said, like, it's only going to get more complicated. I think this is really good evidence of that.
Yeah, and as you were saying just now, that the difference between the structured data testing tool and the rich results is increasingly, as it gets more complicated, you don't just have a recipe. You have a recipe with a video by a person with snippets that references another thing that's published by a different company, et cetera, et cetera. You can't just have those things referenced on the page. You have to describe the relationships. This is very early days, but it's going to get much more intertwined.
Love it, because your schema tells a story, right? And I have maybe been heard said, like, how to manage your brand for machines is through like the schema markup, and that produces this whole marketing data layer. But that's for another conversation. So let's jump into product model definitions and product model and e-commerce. And, I wanted to touch on this because this is actually like based on a blog we wrote originally in 2016, as we're sort of working with some big e-commerce vendors. But we like to start with sort of like, how do, WooCommerce and Shopify talk about variable products or variants, just so we're all on the same page, so you know what I'm talking about when I talk about variations. So, WooCommerce talks about it being a product type that lets you offer a set of variations such as price, stock, size, and more. So, for example, like the combinations could be, a large purple t-shirt or a medium red shirt. And we're just actually using variables. My math background loves like thinking about like all the options there. So, and then Shopify sort of describes it as being like products that come with more than an option, right? So, and then it's the combination of those options that sort of create that product set. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is we're going to talk about like all the different ways you can do schema markup. I'll say like the basic one, like at least get this piece, nail this piece, but what would be the ideal markup? So, to get us warmed up, our brains are just getting started. It's for me, it's after lunch, so here, like your product markup would be just the properties that are shared across the variants. And you might sort of end up in this and that, like you just, you only can do like the most basic markup. Some of the other data isn't available, or it's like not consistent across all your product base. And so what you can see here is, we've called out the product, the names, Clark's fa la 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 la, shoes for men, where the image is, what the description is. And you can see we have like one basic offer, right? We're saying it's 45.99 euros and it's in stock. Now, the build on this is that, okay, well, that's great. You have sort of one product, but perhaps there's different size of products. And again, we, in the sort of, I'll say more ideal markup, we would include all that information about the sizes. But if you don't have access to that, at least use an aggregate offer to show that there's a price range. So in this example, what we're doing is we're building on that previous example, again, calling out the product of the shared things, but then also adding in an aggregate offer. Okay. Now, the next step of maturity or walking towards what's ideal is where, for each offer where there's a specific SKU for it, that you're actually calling those out as the specific offers. So in this case, you have a shoe, right? So we're still talking about the Clark's fa la 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 shoe that has the image and the same description. But now we're actually calling out the fact that there's, 3 different SKUs. You can see they have likely different sizes, like 9, 10, 11, and that, like they each have that unique SKU with, in this case, the same price, same currency, but availability might be different. Okay, so we're separating out the offers. Again, this is better than the basics, but what we would ideally get to, my second example. So this is again, sort of example with the offers, this time, where we're calling out the name, in addition to the SKU. But again, we're not, ideally we have like every single thing called out, including perhaps like the size of the bottle, etc. And in order to do that, I'll say like ideal scenario, you have to actually call out each variation as a product model. And so you can see in the schema markup, like I'm still calling out, so we used an iPhone in this, where we're calling out the product. So the description and the image, and then we're also saying like there's a price range, right? $5.99 all the way to $8.99. And we're calling out an additional property. I decided to just like have a little fun with this one. So additional property is where like you want to define a variable, but that variable in schema.org. So in this case, we're actually saying it's memory and it has a unit code, and the unit code has text, and then it has a value. Additional properties, again, like a more advanced thing that you can do where you basically get to make up your own properties. But because of unit code, there's actually references in unit codes like to different things such as memory, etc. But let's go back to models. So then for each model, so in this case, we're talking about an iPhone, right? So the iPhone, has a different color, and then it has its own offering, and then it has availability. So ideally, you would actually, define, I'll say like the product group and what's common on there. And I'll say properties that tie to it, such as that aggregate price range. But then you would use the property model and then basically the type product model to then go at it and define every single thing that you know. So if you think of like a product landing page, so often there's like a table that has like all the information about that product. Why aren't you marking that up? Like, to help make sure that it's understood so that it can then match it appropriately to where it is. So key takeaway here is ideally your product models are defined with all the information that you have available, and that you're using, I'll say, like the product type at the top to kind of group them together on things that are similar. Mind blown. All right. I sometimes think a visual is kind of helpful. So like on a product page, you might like call out like the different ones. So, you know, on a cell phone page, there might be like, hey, look at our cool iPhone 400. And then you have like, you know, listed below the 3 different types. And so those would be like the product models with their offers. Okay. This goes back to what Jono and I were just talking about. You're nesting it and defining the relationship. And again, something we're really adamant about at Schema App is like being as specific as possible about what it is that you're describing. Calling the product with an offer range is not specific when we actually know that there's versions of that product and variations that go with it.
That's really interesting, because things like you could argue that the difference between a t-shirt that's available in white and red is different to an iPhone with different memory capacities. Like there's a different
Correct.
amount of difference. And yeah, and every site and every type of product will have differences in those differences. And the key is to go and really pore over what kind of definitions does Schema support and what's the closest fit. And, yeah, you end up with these incredibly complex trees with variant products. If you've got 5 different colors and 5 different sizes and 5 different logos, that is a lot of variance. And yeah, everybody's going to need to work out what the right architecture should be. It's
well, and like there's a big difference between like a full polyester shirt and one made out of bamboo, right? So like, and I say that as like a picky buyer that likes to buy bamboo, you know, dresses and t-shirts and so forth, right? Like, wouldn't it be nice then if you actually get results that talk about the fact that they're, you know, made with bamboo versus, you know, 100% polyester? Now, I wouldn't be a good person. I'll talk about analytics. I would say I have a solution for you for this, by the way. And I wouldn't be a good person to say like, hey, you need to do this like super complex markup and you're screwed because no one else can do it out there. We do have some solutions that help you do that. But first, let's talk a bit about analytics. So why I like doing product models and getting into all the nerdy stuff is because once you define those, that data is structured and you can reuse that structure in analytics to ask questions and get insights. And so again, one of our principles at Schema App is like, you know, doing the structured data is step 1, but then we actually want to sort of see how we can leverage that to get insights for the business. So this example is not eCommerce, and I apologize. I was like trying to dig one up, but it gives you the frame point. So this is actually Schema App, and from a while ago where we were saying, you know, which author drives the most sessions on our website from a content perspective. And so we took the schema markup property of author and added it into analytics using a custom dimension. And we do this programmatically at scale. So it's like Martha needs to keep writing blogs because she drives the most sessions to the website. K Mark, co-founder, like, you know, get on it, please. Like, you're 9%, seriously. But you can imagine if you're looking at all those product model variations, like we could ask a question of like, which colored t-shirt drives the most conversion or revenue. Now you might have that because you have a really, you know, great invoicing system. You can track it all down, but, you know, you can ask questions of like, you know, does the number of ratings, like the actual number of ratings on my product, does that actually affect conversion rate? So you can start asking really interesting questions of the data, you know, once you actually do really proper complex schema markup that might then allow your SEO team to influence other parts of the business.
This is huge. If you're a bit of an analytics nerd and if you've got some basic Google Tag Manager skills, it is really easy to take schema markup and transform it into data layer stuff for Google Tag Manager. And then it's trivial to pull that into Google Analytics. Like you can just go, give me everything in my schema graph in Google Analytics and start playing with it. We do loads of this on Yoast.com. It is awesome. It's really transformed the way we think about analytics and page level metrics. Really cool.
Yeah, and Mike Arneson has like a really old article about how to do that. And Tag Manager, his organization is super passionate about Tag Manager. Or if you just want to do it programmatically, look up Schema. We call it enhanced analytics. And this is all part of this process. And I always come back to this process because like the schema markup process, we often like, so strategies like the product models, like how are you going to make sure you're getting the most out of it? How do you get it done? Which again, we're passionate about, but then how do you also use it to enhance like what you're getting out of the business? Okay. So I was just going to say, I would be really mean if I'm like, you have to do this really complicated schema markup and not at least give you a solution. So we actually have built in that most robust, really super nerdy, detailed product models into our WooCommerce, Shopify, and BigCommerce plugins. They're really reasonably priced. They do it at scale. And then for those of you that aren't on those platforms, we also integrate with Google Merchant Center and then can convert your feed into really robust schema markup. And then we also have a highlighter for anything else that doesn't fall in there. So I don't like giving really complicated recommendations without some type of solution to help you find that way. And then the last thing I have, just before I hand it off to my colleague, is we are really passionate about training and teaching and enablement. So our website is full of all kinds of interesting articles. We also have like a whole support area, knowledge base. So these are a couple that I just highlighted for e-commerce around schema markup for product models, collection pages, how to stand out with FAQ, because there's all kinds of ways you can use FAQ in e-commerce, and then a little bit about what we do and how we do it. Yeah, if you want to learn more, you can find our newsletter or sign up for our email course. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jono.
That was awesome. Thank you. Really, really cool. Before I forget, I should also plug that if you're using Yoast and our WooCommerce add-on, you get a whole bunch of this out the box automatically. But that's boring.
That's boring. I know. I tried to whip through that
boring
fast,
company
right?
stuff. Yeah, we've got exciting things to talk about. We didn't mention at the beginning what we're doing with the format of this. So Martha's talked about some bits and pieces. I'm going to look at some of what might be coming next and some interesting odds and ends, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some Q&A. So I've seen some interesting stuff already. So I'll blitz through my stuff, and then we can get to some of the audience questions. So I need to make that sorry, I'm faffing with my second screen so I can attempt to present it. Should have set this up beforehand, really, like an organized person. There we go. Right, like magic. There we go. Okay, so yada, 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 yada.
Go team.
I thought what might be quite interesting to do is, Martha, I didn't brief you for this very well. I thought we might pull up the schema.org page for product and just eyeball it and see what's interesting, because I know there's loads of stuff that nobody even looks at. That's cool. All right, how do I alt-tab out of that with it? There we go, straight to the browser. Nice. Okay, so let's not go through all of these, but I think there's some interesting opportunities. Like the brief was find us stuff that people don't know about, what they don't really do.
Okay, so additional property. That's the one I was just talking about.
Yeah. Anything that's not official and defined and formal, you still want to describe your iPhone has 32 gig of RAM, or however much an iPhone. I don't know, I'm an Android guy. But yeah, you definitely want to be using that. I think one of the things that's really interesting about this is it's an interesting route to getting stuff formalized. So the schema.org standard itself, and we'll come on to some of this, is a little bit of a democracy, and it has a little bit of a catch-22 in that they will adapt the schema.org standard to add new things and to represent new types of properties, but only really when there's demand for that. And there's no demand until people start doing it. So one of the ways you can, I don't know, if one of the great examples is there is no schema.org markup for pets and animals. So if you run, I think we've talked about that. If you run a pet shop, and you really want to take advantage of schema, you can start describing a lizard has 4 feet, a spider has 8 feet, with additional property values, and get enough traction on that they become standardized. So that's pretty cool. But there's loads in here that nobody ever really looks. Loads of stuff in here that nobody ever really looks like. Like audience is a really interesting schema property for a product. Like so many products are targeted at a specific audience, whether that's gender or demographic or age. You can define all of these types of things. Now, you might need to do a bit of work to put that into place, whether it's through the CMS or something like Schema app. But this sort of stuff is really valuable. If you're already describing this in the content or you know it, this is really, really cool. I think it's worth looking at briefly the relationship between brands and products as well. I know in a lot of cases, the relationship is as simple as this is an e-commerce store selling shoes made by this brand. But quite often you'll find that the products are manufactured or retailed or branded by a different organization than the one selling them. And you want to be describing those relationships as well. You don't want to accidentally say that these Nike shoes that my site sells are manufactured by me. That's a different type of relationship. It's really important to get that right. I'll skip over.
Can I jump on the brand one for a second as well?
Yeah, ramble with me.
It's also like really interesting if the e-commerce store sort of focuses on specific brands and that you have a brand landing page that talks about that brand and why you sell it and so forth. So when we talk about, nesting and linking, the brand is good, especially if you're, wanting to define that brand, but maybe you're also trying to get that brand page to to perform itself. So how do you sort of think about linking both the products to it, but then also thinking about what else you can do in that brand page? And here, if you link it appropriately, then, it's really beautiful and nested and can also help drive traffic perhaps back to your brand page.
Yeah,
I think the other important thing to remember about looking at this page is if you go to Google's guidelines, you actually only need 2 of these elements to actually meet their requirements for product schema.
And this is disappointing. I think there was a point. In fact, John Moo came out on a Webmaster Hangout recently and said that there explicitly is value in going beyond just the stuff that Google explicitly rewards. Which, thank you finally, because so much of the SEO community is only focusing on those explicit bits where they can see they get rich results, etc. There is so much more going on. I don't know why I can't. I'm clicking on the wrong screen. That's why I can't click that link. That's difficult. But yeah, there is definitely value in going deeper and describing the nuance, not only because Google might reward and support it in the future, but because there are ways in which they parse and process this that they don't explicitly showcase in the search results that help them understand the relationships between things. And there are other things than Google out there. I want to come on to it briefly, but Facebook uses schema. Bits of Amazon use schema bizarrely. Bing uses schema better than it used to. There are other consumers out there. So it's worth going, if you have this, and you can use this, I know Martha's big on this, is look at what can be done and described and factor that into your strategy, and don't start from what does Google reward and work back, because you'll never get ahead of the competitors.
Yeah, take it back to your customer, right? So like, what are your customers asking for about your products, or what do they love about your products, or why are they buying your products, or why do they buy from you as a store? Those things are the things you want to describe. So I'm not a big of I call it peanut butter schema markup, where you cover everything and just make sure I do love that and you're able to do that, but it should be for that business purpose because it's of interest and sort of going to answer questions or drive relevance for your buyer.
Nice. The big bit I wanted to flag in here was these 3 delightful treats that I see so rarely in the wild. But if I were a search engine trying to understand websites, these are so powerful. And there's some interesting subtleties so the difference between is related to and is similar to is quite interesting. So a sock is similar to another sock, and a sock is related to a shoe, maybe, depending on your product markup and your inventory. But you can start to see there's differences in these descriptions and their relationships, and it can be really, really useful to describe these. One of the things that Martha hinted at when she was talking about the pushing this kind of data into analytics as custom dimensions is that there's a whole other side to schema, which is thinking about how you structure your business data and your inventory and your operational information using these kinds of properties, and then feeding that data in both directions. So you might find that you already have internal types of descriptions and ways of structuring data that might be easy to expose on your website. But the opposite might be true. You might have really robust schema that describes all the relationships between your products, and an absolute minefield of an internal inventory system. You can use this kind of structure in the other direction, which is really, really useful. This isn't just for markup on the web for Google. This can be the single way that you describe all of your stuff. So this kind of stuff is really, really powerful. And the variant in particular. Sorry, go for it.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to build on that. Is we already do this in e-commerce as part of the customer experience. Nice. So for example, people also bought is often at the bottom, right? Or, you're sort of suggesting things that, it's related to, I'm buying my new blender container. Do you want a new blender? Do you need a new, other things do you need more smoothie mix? So we're already building this type of thing into the user experience because we know it helps increase shopping cart size, it helps increase conversion. And so this is just how you can use in schema to do this. So we do this for our e-commerce clients like without a blink, because you've already built that into your experience.
Yeah, and it's not hard to imagine that Google might turn around next week and say, oh, we're building a related product recommendation engine, and they're using this kind of data. That would be really easy for them to do. There's a whole bunch of, so I guess there's a question around effort versus rewards. You can go into a huge amount of depth on this, and you can really go overboard. Like, you could give every single one of the shoes that you sell a height property. Technically, yes. I don't think there's necessarily a huge amount of value unless you're specifically marketing to people who care about how tall their shoes are. But there are things that people really don't go into a lot of depth about. Things like material. And you can put a huge amount of effort to go into here and to define and to describe things. This is the kind of stuff that might be used by other systems. I'm going to come onto it in a minute, but I know that Facebook in particular do use material in some of their catalog stuff, and the rules around what types of materials are valid vary by product and territory and stuff. But it's worth, if your CMS supports it, if you have a tool like Schema-App or Yoast that can manage it, worth putting the effort in and defining this if you've got this kind of information. So, yeah.
I think that's a good one, and part of that comes with approach, right? So, what can you automate to just get as much covered as possible, and how do you just sort of think about that?
Yeah, and lastly, while we're in here, it's worth reminding. I know this is an advanced webinar, but we should touch back on the basics briefly. That every type of schema description, every type of schema thing is derived from a schema thing, and thing is the root entity of all the things. Any property that a thing supports, you can use on your product or your more specific stuff. And in particular, that includes things like a description, a series of alternative names, a series of images, things that it's the same as. These are really powerful properties. These are properties that Google absolutely understands and almost certainly uses in some way behind the scenes. And whether that's explicitly, we know they use the descriptions when they expose rich snippets, but it's and we know that they use the same as property in different ways to understand the relationships between things. These are the things which, if you were a large search engine trying to understand the web, you would be definitely trying to invest and understand. So anytime you have an opportunity to use these generic properties on your specific products and offers and product groups, that's well worth looking at. Okay, let's change gear because we had some other little bits I just wanted to touch on which were worth exploring, because that is all based on what you can do now. There's some interesting stuff coming in the pipeline, and we should save some time for some questions. So what is coming next? This is exciting. This crept into the schema pending, I think it's due for the next release potentially. The idea of a merchant return policy that you can start to describe what your organizational policies are on product returns. And what's really interesting about this, and a few things, but you can do it either at the organization level or at the product level, because you might have some products that have different return criteria, and some of them can only be exchanged, some of them you have to pay for shipping, or you might have a generic policy across the organization. What's interesting about this particular thing is that it was raised by representatives of Google in the schema.org GitHub repo, where they discuss what Google people want to be able to support in schema. So there are actively people at Google working in the search space wanting to be able to describe return policies. So if that doesn't scream to you, we should start thinking about describing these better, exposing them better, and we should consider that Google thinks that having transparency around explicit return policies isn't important, then that's going to be really key. So have a look at these properties, like the distinction between types of refunds and how many days you expect it to take to turn that around. Have all these things ready. You can mark this up now. It might not achieve a huge amount. You can have it in place and ready. So that's pretty cool. This is only going to apply to a few people. I picked out a few interesting ones. These are interesting because you can start to see where Google is going, and you can start to understand what they're trying to achieve. This is all about transparency. How energy efficient is this product? These are the kinds of things that a consumer wants to be able to see and understand at a glance when they're comparing products and services and offers. This is the kind of thing that Google wants to extract and showcase in rich results and snippets and that kind of environment. So if you have this sort of stuff, it's well worth looking at. This one, still very early days and a very early discussion, only 4 days ago, but this is another big conversation. This is a proposal from Google. Look, it says, you can go and read this. This is public. You can go and find out what they're talking about. This is something that Schema does really badly at the moment. How do I describe that I'm offering a service that has a monthly charge? Or how do I describe a product that is paid in 15 installments over 2 years? That sort of stuff is really difficult. There's not a good vocabulary. And that represents most service industries and most high-end products.
We've used some of those additional properties to do this, like, nice. For a long time, right? Like Schema Apps, the subscription service. So yeah, it's this is exciting, and I just wanted to echo, like, if you want to know what's going on, and then if you want to try them, right, like try them, because sometimes when Googlers suggest things, they're already implemented before they're approved.
Yeah, like they're not just throwing this out here because it's a wish list idea of something they're dreaming about. This to have got to this stage of definition and conversation, work and conversations have happened to get it this far. So yeah, the flip side is that this isn't finalized yet, and that there is still debate and discussion around the specifics of how this will work, the mechanisms, the specific naming conventions of tags, the relationships to other things. If you've got time to kill and a real vested interest in how this plays out, you can go and wade into those conversations. You can join this thread, and you can say, I think this should work like this. You'll stir up a honeypot, but there are so few people actively involved in these conversations that if you have an agenda and you want to try and shape where this goes, you absolutely can influence it. So in a way that you really can't in other areas of Google. So that's pretty exciting. The big existential thing that's happening that I just wanted to touch on outside of specific schema properties is what's happening in the world of marketplaces, and particular in Google Shopping and Facebook Marketplace, where they are moving increasingly to what I'm calling Schema-First inventory data, which is not a great way of describing it. Let me explain. Google Merchant Center is where you sell your products through Google. It's the evolution of Google Shopping. It's all of the product results in Google. And what they're saying is that increasingly, rather than you having to generate an XML feed or upload a spreadsheet and do that every morning or build complex systems to synchronize that, they will just read your schema. And you have to do a bit of onboarding, and you still have to sign up for an account and do the things. But now what happens is you no longer need to pay some third-party middleware to generate those XML feeds, which I know a huge number of e-commerce stores do, to pipe them to Facebook and Yahoo and Yandex and wherever else. Now they just read your schema. And increasingly, your website and your web pages become the single version of truth. I saw a question skimmed by a little bit earlier about, do I have to maintain my product inventory, and how does this work dynamically? Well, now your web pages and your schema are the first and single version of truth for that. So when Google comes along and scrapes your page, as it does probably many times per day or per week, depending on your throughput, they update their understanding of your availability and product details and your inventory and price in particular based on your markup on your page. I think this is huge.
I'm not surprised about this though, right? Like we've seen indications of this. Like I would say just like the maturity of where they were like, have structured data, and like we want to see structured data in your merchant feed. And, sort of that evolution has been happening over the last, I'll say like 2 years. It's really been over. The piece though that I love about this, and again, call it existential or the strategic nature of it is, I always talk about like structured data almost being like that data feed for your entire marketing website. And if you think about how consumers are interacting with information differently, I'm getting notes on my watch. My car is telling me things because I'm like trying to go pick up something at a restaurant, or, my phone is now my interface, or my TV is my interface, or my, wall furnace control thermostat is my interface, right? So to me, this is just like, again, start managing your brand at, through schema markup, because like that's going to be, how you can control what's being understood at a data layer, which, I see that disruption happening very clearly. I've seen that for like the last 4 years. It's not new. It's progressing.
Historically, you would have a marketing website and a blog on a subdomain and a data warehouse and a CRM and a database and an app and an integration for a smartwatch. And now all of these things are your website. And whether that's through a combination of progressive web apps and other stuff integrating, but the really interesting bit, your website is a presentation layer on top of the data. And this is the single source of the truth. And this isn't just Google. Facebook are doing the same thing. Facebook's marketplace system is also automatically updating and synchronizing prices and inventory based on your schema on your page, based on any page you're running the Facebook pixel on, which you probably are if you're trying to do any active marketing. This very much is the future of how these systems work. They will consume your web pages. It's not a huge stretch to say that we need to stop thinking about websites as marketing collateral for our potential visitors and audiences and start thinking about them as things which are consumed by different entities, people, types of technology in different ways. All these layers of things coexist on top of each other. And it's not just about, does this look okay? And is the content good? And have I ticked my SEO boxes? It's, is this website and this web page the truest representation of my business and all of its data and attributes? This is huge. That's all I had. I'll skip through that. I've left plenty of time for questions. Hopefully there's some interesting ones that we've missed whilst that has been ticking along.
Yeah, we've got quite a few. That's great, yeah. And I think that's the point that we need to make is that, yeah, this is marked as like advanced. And if you want to just put 2 elements in your structured data, Google will love you. But if you want to get a lot of the places that obviously Jono's mentioned and obviously Schema can certainly help you. We have
There's a question, Paul, that just came up about Merchant Center, and since we're just like finishing up that topic, it might be good. So, does Schema Markup integration for Google Merchant Center work for large sites? And the answer is yes. And we actually do it with some global brands. If people are willing to learn more.
So, Ansby, that's his question that just come in a moment ago.
Ansby B, thank you. Yeah.
Ansby B, yeah, sorry.
While we're on that, it's worth noting that it's not quite perfect yet because it's still based on Google crawling and scraping your pages. So if you have technical SEO issues, which aren't uncommon on very large sites, you might find that there's a delay and it's not quite real time as Google gets to it and find things. But if your site's set up well and you've ticked all your boxes, then it should be even more performant than a conventional approach where you're feeding them something on push.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and you've got to remember is that within their documentation, the Merchant Center, they actually specify that if your feed, your XML feed hasn't been updated, they will actually update your price as they crawl the page. So it's like you say, Jono, it depends on when they crawl that page. I'm
just waiting for Google to let me publish all of our markup directly to them. Like seriously, can that just happen?
We've been talking to some of them about I'm getting way off track, but an alternate. So at the moment, like an alternate way of feeding a web page. So it's so inefficient for Google to have to request this page, get all the headers, download the stuff, pass the JavaScript, all the words and all the pictures and all the colors that are designed for humans, they've got to discard and get the bit they want. Why don't we have a different format where they can just say, get me the data representation of this URL?
Exactly.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, that's it. And like obviously we're all in that SEO realm. We know that there's certain algorithms that Google run that help reduce that crawl, where they won't crawl pages that look very similar to others just based on even the URL itself, if they know those pages are of low value. But anyway, let's go back to the questions before we start going too deep on something else. So Jose mentioned at the beginning, which it would be awesome if you guys could explain the entities and IDs of separate pages. For example, product linking a related product, which I know you went over in your slides. You mentioned IDs, Martha, and you've mentioned the related products as well, Jono.
Yeah, maybe can I share a picture, because I think sometimes a picture helps. And it's a picture I shared previously, but I do think there we go. Can you see that one?
There we go.
Okay, so the reason I show this is like, and it's not, Jono, you should be like, Martha, you haven't defined the relationships between things. Yes, I know. But like, the reason I show this is like, so when you're describing, a product with all these things, you also like, when you're using @IDs, you're actually saying like, this is the review entity, or like, this is the FAQ entity, or this is like the US office entity. And so sometimes, like, especially organizations, like a great one that, whether you're writing a blog or so forth, like there should only be one @ID unique reference to where the organization is described within that website or within that container or on the web, right? Ideally. So, part of when you're putting, for example, like same as for your organization to define where else it's defined is you're again trying to say like, this is our organization where it's specifically defined. So when you're doing the product variations and doing nesting, again, when you're thinking about it, it's like, where is an @ID, like should be that, again, that unique reference to define like, what is that entity and where is it holistically defined? and that's why I shared this, just like, because it's like, and then you explain how things are related. You having like 15 organizations defined, because you're describing it off your blog and off your product, like, isn't really helpful, because it's actually one thing.
Whilst you've got that picture up, I think there was a related question, which was about IDs that span multiple pages.
Yep.
And I think this is something we touched on last time we talked. It really frustratingly, Google does not support or do a good job of matching up relationships between entities with IDs on different pages. So if you have a product page, in this example, all of these relationships need to be defined on this product page, including the address of the US office and the description of the FAQs, etc. You have to build out all of those entities on each page where you want to describe them. You can't say this blog post was written by this author over on that URL, because they won't match those relationships up. You have to describe that author in full with the ID in context.
So I've seen them doing a better job of that. So I actually disagree with you. So I think you have to describe enough to sort of describe what that entity is, but you can relate back to that URL, and they're smart enough to like understand that, like that whole piece is there. Now, the structured data testing tool used to be really crappy though at reporting on this, where, for example, like we'll only go 3 hops deep within our markup. So if like your organization has like 5 people on it, and then those 5 people have these FAQs, or like, at some point, like go to that organization page and find out all that information about it. So I am seeing Google do a better job of that. And I would say, like, from a, from the nesting and purist approach, like you have to relate some of that information, but as long as, again, that ad ID, or in a technical term, the URI is defined and is unique, Google's smart enough to figure that out.
Yeah. And even if they don't explicitly connect those cross page, they consume each page and they can imply it in the background.
Correct.
Sneaky with their wording.
We have to be specific, right? That's where, like, that's why it's important.
That's it. So Jason has asked the question: can you add schema for any discounts or coupons? So I don't know if anyone wants to pick up on that at all. It's getting quite specific there.
Yes.
Like that one, yes.
So if you also have a look in GitHub, there's something called discount offer. It's not in pending, but Google understands it. And so that's something to check out.
That's it, right. And Tony's got one. How do you dynamically link stock levels with a more static schema declaration? So I think they're on about, I would say you probably have to get your dev team to place a data layer and send that information through.
Or call Martha. Come on. Well, no, I think the other piece, like, it really means what you're trying to describe within the stock level. So I'm actually reading the question a bit differently, right? So in the definition of schema.org, there's very specific, like, is it in stock, right? Is it out of stock? I think there might be a third one. So if you want to,
there's about 6.
Yeah, there's more that they put in. So part of it is like, how do you map? It's like, it's a data mapping question, your stock levels to those. One thing about schema.org is Google is very specific on the language they want you to use, like within the, like, they'll call it enumerations. Like these are the like 5 options you give, you have to do them specifically. And so part of it's like a data problem of like, how are you going to map, your versions of stock levels within your inventory system to those enumerations that have been defined within schema.org. And then if you want to describe more about, like, perhaps number available, like additional property might be something that you want to use for that.
I've just shared a blog post link that I wrote a while back, which covered some of this, which was the challenges I went through trying to map the relationships between schema.org's enumeration of stock options versus Facebook's versus a few others. So, for example, Facebook says in stock as 2 words, whereas schema is in stock or 1 word. Facebook supports a back order concept, i.e. this is out of stock, but you can place an order and you'll get it when you get it. There's no such thing in schema, though there are discussions. So I had to unpick and work out how do you marry all of those up. If you're interested, I will dump a link in.
That's great.
That's super. And Web for Palmer, I'd love to see more about putting a schema data into analytics reports. Is there any good articles or training videos, Martha?
Yeah. So, is it okay if I share? It's like sometimes helpful if I. There's 2. My esteemed colleague Mike Arneson wrote one for Moz. Oh, don't laugh. 2014. Nothing new.
Wow.
right? Like, so this is a great one. Semantic analytics is, I would say, like the technical term for it. If you want to also learn more, we have a ton of articles both here and again, like under our knowledge base. So if you want to kind of learn the benefits of it and how it works and examples of it, sort of, tons of different examples here. So those are 2 resources that I would go to.
That's super. So yeah, carrying on through the questions. Andrea Molan has asked a question. In product markup, you can add some generic keywords such as category for the name field. Example, XYZ is the product name, sneakers are for men, and the product name XYZ sneakers for men. Let's get a bit spammy.
Yeah, I would be very careful about trying to market in your data. This is not what it's for. It's not how Google want to use it. And a whole bunch of their guidelines actually have some really great examples of.
I know. I was just going there. That's where I was going. I was like, I think this may be an example. Like, discounts can't be like in the name of it, right? Like,
yeah.
I just be careful. Like, I guess part of it is, like, structured data should be used like to articulate what it is, right? And not necessarily to, I'll say keyword stuff or kind of market within it. But there's that good sort of in my piece, like there's often that like plus or minus, like they give usually some pretty good examples about like how to talk about, a product's not an offer, for example, right? Or, what to kind of put in there. So
and there are other fields for that sort of thing, right? If they're sneakers for men, describe the fact that they're sneakers and use the audience attribute
for
to say
men.
Yeah.
Boom, yeah.
Magic.
That's
why there's all those properties there, right? Like it's like you could actually describe everything. Like think beyond the documentation.
Yeah. Like the Google rich results schema documentation has some great examples of very contained things you can do, but it's not a great way of thinking about schema. Like the schema.org documentation is where you should be really putting your brain power in.
Yeah, and there's like 42 properties and 840 classes. Like someone's always like, I can't describe it. I was like, actually, I think you can almost describe anything in there.
Yeah,
exactly. Our friend Jason Bernard has asked the question: how much of a problem are the errors in Google Reports in the structured data testing tool, which is
I have a strong opinion.
Game breakers, or is it just digest what they can, ignore the error? Or does
you mentioned red t-shirts and he appeared out of nowhere.
Yeah, that's it.
So I dislike how Google says that your markup has an error in it if you choose not to include a property that they have as a required property within their documentation.
Images on recipes.
Correct. Yeah. So like, for example, like you decide, so job postings is like one of my favorite. I don't post the salary range on my job postings. I choose from a business perspective that you need to have a conversation with me about that. I'm not going to put it on my job posting. Google's like, error. Okay, there's no errors in my schema app generated schema markup. Thank you very much. And by the way, like it's actually okay if I don't include that required field because it's a business decision or like that information doesn't exist. So I actually think like it should be a warning, like, hey, you're not going to get this rich result because it has this required property. You should really consider looking at that as part of your content strategy or kind of looking at adding that. And then the warnings are basically just like you're missing a recommended property. So I actually think, for an area of search that's about being specific and clear, their warnings and errors are misguided. However, like they are to tell you that, you will not be eligible for that rich result. And so from that standpoint, they should not be ignored. You should take them as, input into your content strategy or for that page and highly consider including the required properties so that you have the opportunity to get that rich result. But they are not like, doesn't mean that like there's commas missing or quotes missing or that, you've done wrong schema. Rant over.
No, 100%. Only 2 minor thoughts on that. One is their email communication about from the Google Search Console emails is equally appalling. And we flag this a lot, and we're making some progress talking to the right people at Google. They have now acknowledged that there are issues, which is nice, but they'll say, you have an error with your recipes, you're missing tools. And I'm like, I don't need tools to cook an egg other than a frying pan. Don't really need to list the frying pan. And they're so aggressive and poorly worded. So there's a huge part of this is just Google are not good at communicating the nuance
That's
of
right.
this isn't technically required, but we would like it to, yada, yada.
The good news is though, is that like, there's like documentation updates page now that they now share. Love it. Yeah. And I think like over the last month, they tried to clarify 8 different things. So they're striving to do better. Good job, Google. Good job.
Yeah, they're getting there. The other thought was if there are legitimate errors in the schema, yes, that's an issue. If it's saying
correct,
this is duplicated or this is erroneous or this is a closing bracket that shouldn't be here, then do not ignore that. Go and fix it in the same way that you wouldn't leave broken code on a page.
Correct.
Perfect. Yeah, I like your view on the errors. It's a Google thing.
So frustrating.
Right, so Tony McCreath has asked the question. Some people are getting concerned about adding structured data. Makes it easy for competitors to find out what they're doing, like price comparing. What do you think? You go. Sorry, we're both grumpy. You were both.
They can read the page.
Yeah. And if you're competing on price or the color of your t-shirts, then you have a bigger strategic problem. And either Google or Amazon are going to eat your lunch in the next week or so anyway. Anything you could expect. There is one exception that I'll think about, which ties back to the things you might push to analytics, etc. Is there are some categories of information which are business relevant, business critical, business providing, like you would never want to expose your returns rate in your schema markup. Well, it might be useful for analytics. It might be useful for conditional tagging and page behavior. That sort of information is quite valuable. But anything where you're just describing what's on the page in schema, that's not competitive advantage, surely.
Yeah.
I do think it's, and I'll echo something I said earlier. Like, I do think that having that data layer there means that the interface for which people are trying to find out information about your, like that sort of becomes less important. And so I think, think of it as, like, how do you make sure that experience of buying and so forth is really, really awesome? Because like, I see that distributing over time, like with Google Shopping and Facebook, et cetera.
Yeah. And the other thing you need to realize is if your competitors are looking at your prices, like you say, they can go on your website and see that anyway. Yeah. But if they are like half educated, they're not going to be looking at it manually. They're going to be looking at automated. So
scraping
there's going to be other ways that you're going to be able to stop them from getting that information quite easily.
Great point, Paul.
Yeah, and I've blocked many a site from doing that. So there's other ways that you can stop them getting that information rather than worrying about what you're putting in your structured data. To obviously help send a much clearer signal to Google. So Automatus M-Track, will Schema for Service ever come back? I think it's gone.
Service isn't gone, right? Yeah. So, services schema markup, just like the other 820 ignored types within schema.org, is alive and well. I think what you have to think about is, and this is sort of a principle we work really hard with our customers on, is that, like if you can't get the rich result you want for it, like get creative, right? With regards to, like you're talking about your services, like talk about FAQ about that services, which can get a rich result. Talk about how to, on how that works. I have seen some people started to do like a multi-type entity. Advanced, right? Maybe we can talk about that in another conversation, where you can say like it's a service and a product. A product is something you purchase, but it is actually a service, and therefore, when you do multi-type entity, it merges the properties. Of course, we do this in Schema app because we're nerds. But like that's a way I think that you can try to like get that product rich result. But a service isn't a product, and so I think for me, like I still think that again, get creative, use other types of rich results to embed and nest under your service, saying like it has, is a subject of a video, has part FAQ page, or do a multi-type entity and make sure you're clear that it's both. Like the thing I'm also really sad about is just like that they took away I always call it the ratings rich result, but it's the review snippet for blogs. Like, come on, Yoast is also really sad about this, right? So, like that's something for me that's really sad, because I do think that like that's something that makes sense and helps us as users identify good quality content if it's being captured in a way that is honest. So I think there's ways around service. For me, I'd like to see the ratings rich result come back for creative works.
Yeah, I should echo, multiple typing is so powerful. And actually, Google is surprisingly good at handling it. And
I know.
There's an example somewhere that I think a book can be a book and a product. So you can have a product that has chapters and an author, and they just add the properties. And it's so powerful. Like, don't overdo it. Don't have a person
like a house is a great example, right? Like a house is a product, right? It's for sale. It has a price. We like multi-type entities.
Yeah, really, really cool.
We should end on that, because like that's a kind of a fun lead into maybe what we're talking about next.
Yeah, I think the next question is the one that we should end on, which is from Eval. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Cohen. What would you say is the biggest gold you tell people that they don't end up implementing? So what's the bit of gold that you tell people consider a number of times to implement and they still don't do it?
Interesting.
Anyone?
Interesting. I'm just desperately
we keep
trying
the gold for ourselves.
So why don't they do it, even though I tell them to do it? I think people get in their own way of like wanting to try to do it historically with like for us, like with developers, and then they don't get those resources, or they get the resources and then something on the page changes in the architecture, and so they so for like the deals I lose, they tend to come back. They'll call me like a year later and be like, so we tried it. We actually don't know what we're doing. It's more complicated. I think not only do we need some technology help, but we also need some of your high touch support, because I want to do multi-type entities and I'm trying to do this like massive e-commerce piece on a enterprise solution. And so that's like the bit of gold I often talk about is like it's also more than just code, right? So like putting in the code is easy, right? I just showed you all the code, like just go do it, like to figure that out. But the fact is that it plays back into how you're writing content and how your pages are changing and how your data architecture works and how you're going to map your inventory availability to the different pieces. And so I guess like it's complicated and it's more than code. It's actually strategy, which is why the best SEO strategists know that this is something that they need to get their heads around and get done.
Nice. I have a similar flavor, which is that, so I'm in a luxurious position where a lot of what we do is sort the technical side automatically out the box, which is nice. But then people, in some cases, still don't really take advantage of it. And a lot of that is retraining how people think, because we're stuck in a world where a lot of SEO is be given a keyword, write a page about the keyword, publish the page, tweet it a bit, buy some links from some dodgy agency, move on. The new model is going to be so much more about how do I structure and architect and publish a resource, and how do I describe the components of that, and how do I think about the qualifications of the person who researched the content? How do I think about the metadata for the images I'm including? How do I think about the relationship between the people who commented on this to the organization they work for? All of these things. And there's a huge requirement that people start thinking about content and data as related things in a way that there's just it's never been anyone's job. So nobody's ever really owned it. And that, I think, is the hardest bit, is saying these aren't just pages of text anymore. These are now all databases and text. So you've got to have all those skills together. And nobody's really there yet, I don't think.
Yeah, I think with me, it's more a case of I explain to people why they should implement structured data at a much deeper layer rather than just what Google tells you, because everyone's just focused on, we want to rank on Google. So, I mean, and then they don't put the budget where they need to be putting it. And then they're wondering why in sort of like 6-12 months time, why they're not really sort of like excelling as much as they could do, because they could have been sending much richer, more information about their products, their business, whatever it is, a blog post, for example. Why they're not getting that traction and the longevity of the work that they've put in. And the way I always explain it is that you're going to get someone to sit down and do the research and get all of the images, infographics, whatever it is for this big pillar piece of content that you're going to do, and then you're going to scrimp on the budget by not sort of like dusting the gold on top to really sort of like drive that information through to the search engines at a much richer level. And
Totally.
I think Jono's just had a technical glitch.
He's like, he's out of here.
I'm sure he'll probably jump back.
On that happy note.
That's it, yeah. So, yeah, it's been really great. And thanks, Martha, for coming along. And Jono, if you're still listening, it's great to have you. And yeah, we've got another webinar coming up in September. And we've got Jason Bernard on the brand cert guy, should I get it right? And there's Jono, just in
Sorry,
time.
my bad.
That's fine. I was just wrapping it up, really, Jono.
I missed the best bit.
That's it, yeah. So it's been great, and thank you for you guys sharing all the information around e-commerce and structured data.
My pleasure.
I was just mentioning that we've got another webinar coming up in September with Jason Bernard, Jono, and myself, obviously. Martha's sitting that one out, unfortunately. So
we'll talk to you in October.
Yeah, she'll be back. That's no problem. And thank you for so much for putting this on. And if anyone else has got any questions, reach out to us as usual on social media or put some questions in the comments of this video on YouTube.
Awesome.
Nice one. Pleasure as ever. See you all later.
No problem.